Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. So the reason why I wanted to have you on was because you're a psychologist, and that's something that I've been considering doing for a long time. So could you break down what a day in your life is actually like?
Yeah, so I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm a practicing clinical psychologist. So basically, I do therapy all day long. I do one-on-one individual therapy. That's my day job. So I get to the office and I probably see maybe 5 people a day is kind of like an average caseload. And yeah, it's just basically 50 to a 60-minute therapy sessions. And we talk about a variety of stuff. I specialize in anxiety and insomnia. Those are kind of my two issues. So normally they're around that. So yeah, that's kind of my day job. I don't do any research. I don't really do any consulting. Psychologists can do a number of things, but I'm kind of purely a clinician, and I work in a private practice, like an outpatient clinic. So I'm not like in a big hospital or anything. And then so that's my day job, but then I also do a lot of my own kind of writing and blogging and podcasting and stuff on the side. And so I typically get to the office pretty early, like maybe 5:30, and I work out a little bit, and then I do, for the first couple hours of the day, I work on my writing. So I might be writing blog posts or editing a podcast or reading, doing research for stuff. So that's kind of a typical day. And then I get home by 3 p.m. usually. I've got young kids, and so I like evenings and weekends are totally family time. And my wife and I are trying to do some homeschooling with our kindergartner because of the coronavirus. So she's not in school. So I'm in charge of weekday afternoon school stuff. So that's kind of a typical day these days.
I love it. And there's a lot to break down in there. One of the things that I want to talk to you about was why you started publishing online. It's my understanding that you started doing that in 2018 sometime. And so I'm curious why you decided to take that leap when you're working already.
Yeah. So it's kind of a multi-stage process. I would say, so I got out of grad school and started practicing in 2015. And then within about a year, not only does this happen with my own clients, but just people I knew, family, friends, people I'd meet, whatever, I was getting the same question all the time, which is, I've got, a nephew or a brother or a spouse or someone who I think needs therapy. Like, how do you even go about like finding a therapist? Like it just seemed so kind of overwhelming for people. And it's a topic I'm passionate about because I think my field does a pretty crummy job of making itself accessible and understandable just to your average person. It's kind of esoteric and mysterious, and weirdly, it's almost partly by design. I think there's like weird stuff going on. Like mental health professionals often have this kind of air of mystique and we're so special. And so it ends up alienating people, I think, and making the process really confusing. And so I just hate that. So I was always really passionate about these conversations, but it started getting exhausting because I was having these long, in-depth conversations, but basically saying the same thing over and over again to everybody. So I thought, this would be a lot easier if I could just like hand them something and say like, here's everything I know about how to find a therapist. And so I just basically wrote a book, and I didn't really have a plan, but I just like started typing out all my thoughts on different types of therapy and how to think about whether a therapist is a good fit for you and how much therapy costs and insurance and how long it takes and how to recognize a good therapist or not. And so I put this together. I threw it up on Amazon, and, I told family and friends about it, and I got a few sales, and then it was like crickets. And it's not that I was expecting like a bestseller, but it kind of shocked me how like you can put all this time and energy into something and put it out there. And then again, aside from like my grandmother, I'm not going to get like a ton of sales. Right. So that made me, it clicked for me, this idea that I'd kind of heard like rumbling around the kind of blogging, podcasting world of like, you need an audience, if you want to do something, like it's good to have like a group of people who are kind of interested in you and your work. And so that kind of led me to consider, like starting a blog. I liked the writing process. Like I liked talking about psychology and therapy and that kind of stuff. And so I thought I could definitely do more of this, but I should be more intentional about kind of cultivating having a website, having a newsletter, cultivating a sort of an audience of people who are interested in me and kind of the way I think about things. So yeah, in late 2017, I started blogging, and the real like motivating impulse, I would say, is that there's so many ideas and techniques and practices and just wisdom from the world of psychology, therapy, behavioral science that we spend all day applying to like a clinical population, right? People who are in very significant ways struggling with things like anxiety or depression. But what kind of dawned on me like pretty quickly was a lot of this stuff would be super helpful to people, even if they don't have major depression or clinical levels of anxiety, or like, why can't we apply like everybody can benefit from this stuff, right? and like I thought like, what the hell? Like, why don't I start kind of explaining some of the stuff that I think is helpful to a more lay audience, I guess, people who don't need these insights but could benefit from them. And so that was kind of the little like tagline for my blog has been practical psychology for meaningful personal growth. And that's sort of pushed me through the last few years. And I love writing about this stuff and talking about it and thinking more about it. And so, yeah, that was kind of the start.
That's awesome. And so my follow-up question to that is, do you believe that just a normal person should be going to therapy on a weekly basis or a monthly basis? How do you determine, should everyone be going to therapy? Is it something like the gym where it's something overlooked? What's your take on therapy for just the average person?
Yeah, I guess my like soundbite answer to that would be definitely not everybody needs therapy, but just about everybody could benefit from it. And I say therapy there in like a very general sense. I would lump in things like coaching, right, or mentoring or something like that. So I think it's this, there definitely is a set of people who would fall into the category of, you know, they're really struggling in some areas of their life and they clearly need therapy to kind of get back to baseline, right? But I think there's a lot of people who are at baseline or even doing fairly well in some areas of their life for whom the process of therapy just could be really helpful in terms of growth, in terms of personal growth, self-awareness and understanding. And I think, again, it's a problem with my field that we're so pathology focused. We're like, what's the problem and how do we fix the problem? But my field has so much potential for growth, from not only going from bad to okay, but from going from okay to excellent, right? And so that's just sort of an idea I'm pretty excited about. And my own like blogging and teaching and writing and stuff online is sort of an outlet for that.
So what are some of the things that you've noticed, particularly in the past 12 months since quarantine started and COVID, that have been problems that have come up in your practice that people are coming to you and a new surprise? Is there anything new about the problems that people are facing?
Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff. Probably the most surprising kind of development would be at the beginning of all this, you might think or predict that anxiety would be the big sort of emotion and obstacle people would be struggling with, because it's, you know, for a lot of people, it can be a really severe illness and that it's just scary. It's a scary thing, right? But what I found is by far the bigger thing people are struggling with is grief, in the sense that a lot of people have just lost a lot as a result of the pandemic. So it could literally be like losing loved ones, right? People have died because of it. But more commonly, I think it's losing huge aspects of your life, right? So whether it's your like, I don't know, weekly like bowling league, you know, where you hang out with all your buddies and like socialize, or it's your gym, you know, some people are really like, for a lot of layers, like they're attached to their gym, you know, or family, like not getting to go visit family who lives far away. And so I think that has been something that has surprised me, and I think caught a lot of people off guard, is that the thing that's hardest is this kind of people are just sad. It's just really sad and disappointing that these huge chunks of our lives have been sort of taken away, and trying to figure out how to deal with that. And then on top, what makes that even harder is a lot of the things that we've lost, hopefully temporarily, as a result of the virus and lockdowns and all that kind of stuff, is people have lost coping mechanisms, right? So for a lot of people, for instance, who struggle with kind of mild or moderate anxiety or depression, exercise is like one of their big coping mechanisms, like it just really helps them, right? And for a lot of people, it's like social exercise in particular, whether it's like CrossFit or a Zumba class or yoga or whatever, and they just haven't been able to do that. And so a lot of these kind of latent issues that a lot of people might have. Again, whether it's something like anxiety or loneliness, depression, whatever it might be, they're just a lot harder to deal with because we've sort of been stripped of a lot of or even it's just like talking to a good friend. Like we just can't do that as much as we used to. And so everything gets harder because in a way we sort of took for granted all these parts of our lives that, in addition to all the other things they were doing, they were kind of coping mechanisms for our own sort of a lot of our struggles and difficulties.
So if you have someone who is feeling down or feeling the lack of separation for someone, what are you telling them to do? What are the practices that you're recommending? I mean, it's pretty hard to think about someone who lost a loved one or just can't see a friend anymore. Like what are you telling them? What are you recommending? What are you saying to them?
Yeah, so there's kind of a couple levels here. Like I think there's basically two levels to think about this problem. One is you can look for quick or immediate substitutes. So like, I don't know, if you can't do your like hot yoga class at the gym anymore, and that was like a major source of not only exercise but socializing and connection in your life. Maybe you kind of like organize a yoga class in the park and like you step up, and even though it's not really your personality, like that's something you have to kind of do if you want to get kind of compensate for that loss. So I think that's a big part of it, is like creativity actually, and the confidence to kind of go outside of your comfort zone. Again, a lot of it is stuff like there were things in our lives that were basically organized for us, like you were, again, like you're in a bowling league or you're in this hot yoga class or, whatever it is, things that you could just sort of like fall into. And what a lot of the work I've ended up doing is helping people to become confident enough and creative enough to become more proactive in areas where they weren't used to being proactive, and to really initiate things and kind of be creators, like really having to create new aspects to their life, which is, it's a pretty wild thing. Like it's surprising how we kind of get in our lanes in life and we get kind of comfortable doing certain things. So it's my hope that I think that in the long term, there will actually be a big silver lining here. And this will be a really useful and kind of empowering thing for people to look back on and say like, yeah, I really learned how to become a lot more assertive, like interpersonally, because I need these like relationships in my life. And previously they just sort of fell into my lap, but like I have to go out and get them now. And that's, if you can actually build that skill, like that's huge. That's going to benefit you for years, for the rest of your life, probably.
So what were the two layers there? You said there were two layers.
Yeah, sorry. I got so excited, just ran
You're
off
good.
of the second one. The first one is just sort of basic coping, right? So everyone, if all of a sudden, like you can't hang out with your best friend anymore like you used to, and that was a major source of good, like you gotta like figure out ways to just kind of like put the Band-Aid on and deal with that. Like you start calling them more often, or figure out other people you can spend more time. Kind of like triage, like putting the Band-Aid on things, like stop the bleeding, like that's a big part of it. And honestly, a lot of that is just what a shrink will call validation. So someone comes in, they say like, yeah, I'm just really struggling with, I just get really lonely. And I know I shouldn't, because like I've got all these people who love me and I've got all these things I should be doing. And like, so I don't know what I need to do. And I just kind of go, whoa. Why wouldn't you be feeling super lonely? It makes total sense that you would be feeling really lonely right now. And that sucks. Like it's painful to feel lonely, right? But it's okay that you're feeling lonely right now. It makes sense given what's going on. And so that's that skill of validation, of telling people and helping them see, just because you're suffering, just because something hurts, doesn't mean it's bad or that you're bad, right? And it seems simple, but a lot of people don't have a lot of experiences in their life where they get that. A lot of people in their life who are good at doing that. And so that's one really important kind of service I try to sort of offer people.
Do you think we've become almost, we expect it always to be good? And this situation in 2020 for the first time was the first time in a lot of people's lives where it was bad and it was suffering. And we almost expected it to be good forever. Do you see that playing a part at all?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's this kind of unintended consequence of a lot of different fields, whether it's sort of like psychiatry and the medical side of mental health, or the behavioral side, like therapy and counseling, or even sort of like the whole self-improvement, self-help world. I don't think anyone's doing this on purpose, but one of the implicit messages people are learning is that you've got all these great ideas and services like therapy and medication and all these great self-help programs and frameworks and life hacks. And like the implication is you ought to feel awesome all the time if you're just doing the right stuff, right?
Yep.
If you're just like doing your mindfulness every day and exercising every day and like watching really inspiring YouTube videos and like on all the right medications, and like, you'll be good, right? You should just be super good. And then it turns out when you're not only do you feel bad about feeling bad.
Yep.
And that is the real problem. Feeling bad isn't a problem. Everybody feels bad sometimes, especially when majorly bad stuff happens, like a global pandemic. Why wouldn't you start to feel lonely? Why wouldn't you be upset and frustrated? Why wouldn't you be kind of depressed or kind of anxious? Of course you are. The subtle problem is that people assume because I'm feeling bad, there's something wrong with me. I'm not doing something right, right? And this is, I've never seen any research that actually backs this up quantitatively, but it's my clinical experience that the way painful emotions work is they're not additive, they're multiplicative. So if you feel lonely and then you feel guilty for feeling lonely, 10 units of loneliness plus 10 units of guilt does not equal 20 units of feeling bad. It's 100 units of feeling bad. When you combine painful emotions, they just explode. So, which is why it's so important that you are able to stop with that first layer and say, you know what, I don't like feeling lonely or anxious, but it's okay. Like, it makes sense, even though it feels bad, and I would prefer not to feel this way. There's nothing wrong with me because I'm feeling like this. If you can avoid adding that second layer of difficult emotion, it's remarkable actually how well you can weather pretty substantial difficulties. But it's just so ingrained in us that it's back to this thing of we feel bad about feeling bad. And that's like one of my core jobs, I think, both as a therapist, but even in my own writing, is to help people try and understand that distinction.
How much do you think that social media plays a role in people feeling bad about feeling bad because they're looking at everyone else's life and they're saying, well, this person's on a yacht in Dubai and this person is hanging out in Costa Rica with monkeys. Their lives seem pretty good. What am I doing here lonely? How much do you think that plays a part?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to quantify it exactly, but I mean, there's no way it doesn't play some role there. And I think I don't know that it's so specific as like, yeah, if I was just working harder, I'd be able to afford a yacht too. I think it's a little bit more subtle in terms of everyone else just generally seems to be doing okay. In other words, it's not that they have a yacht, it's that they're smiling. Every single photo, they're smiling, right? Or like they and their spouse are always together smiling and they just look super happy all the time. And like, but what's wrong with me and my spouse? Like we're fighting again, like there must be something really wrong with us. So it's really like a selection effect. It's a selection bias where social media makes it really easy to filter out all the negative stuff and present only the good stuff. And if you're in that world and you're not careful, if you're not constantly sort of reminding yourself, I'm sure like that glamorous like celebrity or influencer, they have fights with their boyfriend and girlfriend too sometimes. And that's just hard to do. So yeah, I think it definitely plays a role. You can't help but fall into that comparison trap sometimes, unless you're super careful and conscientious about how you curate sort of your social media life. I mean, it's one of the reasons why the only real social media platform I use is Twitter, because I feel like I have much more control over being able to curate what I get exposed to, between sort of like muting and blocking and following and unfollowing and then lists. Like you can really, if you're conscientious about it, you can really exert a lot of control. And it seems to me that you just don't have as much control with other platforms. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but to answer your question, for sure.
What are you looking for when you're curating your feed on social media? What type of person are you looking to follow or looking to hear more from?
Yeah. So I think there's a few principles. The first is just like interesting. Like, are they just intellectually stimulating? Like that's just like the first one. Do they pretty consistently put out things that make me think? The close second is probably helpful. Like, are they just like very pragmatically helpful and valuable? Do they offer like just, I don't know, whether it's like tips or good advice or windows into their own processes and how stuff's working? Like, that's really big. And then I think like this is not something I necessarily think of like one before I follow someone. This is something I think of after I'm following someone. If there starts to be a pretty high percentage of me seeing that person and through no fault of their own, it starts to play mind games with me. Like I find myself feeling guilty or like doing a lot of comparisons, or then I know that I put them on a different list, or maybe I mute them for a while, or, I mean, if it's really bad, maybe I'll just unfollow them altogether. But I think it's kind of a bigger mindset thing of social media it's a tool that you ideally are using and monitoring proactively, right? And if you're doing that, I think it's amazing. Like I love social media for the most part, but I think it's because I'm relatively good at filtering out the ones that would play on my weaknesses and being conscientious about how I use the ones that I do use. And it's hard. It's a big ask. I think it's taken me a long time to figure out how to do that.
I love how you said that you unfollowing or you muting might have nothing to do with that person and instead has something to do with you, because I think we are so quick to take things personally, like, oh, this person unfollowed me, that must mean that they don't like me anymore. But in reality, it could just be that they're not ready to consume your stuff, or they feel bad when they consume your stuff for no fault of your own. So
exactly. Yeah, like I follow a lot of people who are sort of in the kind of creator economy, like indie business kind of stuff. And sometimes people will just, I mean, frankly, I love what they're putting out and I admire it, but I'm in a position in my own business where seeing that stuff right now is not helpful to me. And so it's not a big deal. It's not personal. I just mute them for a while until I'm back in a space where that's okay for me. So I think that's key. And it's one of the beauties, I think, of Twitter is that you have so much granularity over that sort of thing, which as a psychologist and for my own well-being I really value that.
Well, it's awesome. So how long, you talk a lot about personal growth on your Twitter, on your blog, and how long have you been on your personal growth journey? And what does that look like?
Yeah, so it's funny. I think for a long time I was probably maybe starting in college, but then more in kind of my mid-20s. I'm 35 now, so maybe about 10 years ago. At that point, that was like just like the dawn of like Facebook and Twitter and kind of like social media 2.0. And at that point, it was mostly books. Like I've always been a reader. And so I'll admit it. I like kind of self-helpy stuff, like self-improvement stuff.
Same.
Like I dig it, and so I was always a reader. And then there was this period for probably like 5 to 6 years where I was just following a lot of blogs and a lot of podcasts that just resonated with me. And if I'm being honest, I didn't think about it as like a personal growth journey or like activity. It was just, I've kind of curated like a list of people who I just find either really interesting or really helpful to me. And like, so for years I was listening to podcasts and I would listen for the content, a show about X. But I was also kind of just intrigued by this whole podcasting thing. And it wasn't like I've got this big master plan for like starting a podcast empire, but at some point in my life, I was like, yeah, you know what? Like starting a podcast would be cool. And then all that kind of almost sort of passive exposure to podcasts and sort of loosely thinking about podcasting, I was ready to do it. I was so much more because I'd been kind of soaking up all this information and experience about podcasting. And so to kind of get back to your question a little more directly, I have kind of a passive approach to personal growth, I guess, which is kind of weird because in a lot of ways I advocate for a more intentional, proactive one. But yeah, I don't know. Now you got me thinking. So we'll do a 2.0. We can come back to this question.
I love it. Yeah, no worries. And so how much has being a therapist helped you with your podcast in terms of listening to people, asking questions? Because that's something that sometimes I think of myself as a therapist in the podcast host chair, trying to figure out and tease out some of these things that you, the patient, can tell us. So how much has that impacted your podcast, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it has to some degree. Although I think the way I would qualify it is not as much as you would think. And I think the bigger factor is actually listening to other podcasts. And in particular, listening with an ear for like the how, not just the what. So, and by that distinction, I mean, in college, I was an English major. And when you study like English literature, especially in college and beyond, it's not just about what's happening in the story, right? A big part of studying literature is the art itself. Like how does the particular like rhyme scheme of a poem support the theme or the idea in the poem itself, right? So the craft, the art, the how is in a lot of ways just as important as the what, like the idea. So I feel like I've just got sort of like in this case, an ear for that. Like I just kind of in a nerdy way, like I just enjoy thinking about, the way Tim Ferriss interviews is different than the way Tyler Cowen interviews. And I like different aspects of both of them. And it's not that I'm like studying podcast interviewers and like taking tons of notes and stuff. I'm just genuinely in a nerdy way kind of interested in like, why do I think some people are really good interviewers or not? And then again, in sort of this like sort of passive way, I think when it came time for me to be an interviewer, I had this sort of like wealth of kind of passive information and experience where I could say like, yeah, like I kind of like Tyler Cowen's sort of rapid fire, almost disorienting kind of questions, but not totally like that. I want a little more like context, like ease people in. And so I think, I think listening to with sort of a kind of a geeky perspective, listening to other podcasts has actually been much more influential in terms of how I run my own podcast.
Wow, that's really interesting. I wouldn't have thought that because, you're forced when I'm sure, talk to me about being a therapist then, like what that's like and what's the difference there?
Yeah. So one way to look at it is, for me, podcasting is actually very selfish. Like the point of me having a podcast truly primarily is I need an excuse to have conversations with my like intellectual heroes. Like I've read this book 5 times and I recommend it to hundreds of people because I think it's so effing brilliant. And then it just like dawns on me one day, like, oh, like I could just email this person and ask them if they want to be on my podcast. Right? And podcasting is still new enough that people are like, oh, cool, I can be on a podcast, sure. And so I get to have a conversation with this one of my idols, And so I think that kind of positive selfishness, like I'm not in it to like sell anything necessarily. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm not even in it primarily like for my listeners. I'm in it because I'm just really interested in this person's ideas and like how they see the world and how they think. And I think as long as that doesn't go too far, I think that actually makes for really compelling listening. Like and I'm certainly not the first one to say this, but my sort of the theory I ascribe to for why podcasts are so compelling is that it's an opportunity for you to be a fly on the wall and overhear 2 really interesting people have a conversation. And in a lot of ways, again, it's not the what so much. It's not what the topic they're talking about. It's the way they think and the way they ask questions and the way they sort of think through things and see the world. Getting to see that is like mind-blowing, like so cool and just like interesting to me. And so I want to be able to provide that for the people I listen to. So that's podcasting. But that's very different than therapy. Like in therapy, like there are way different goals. It's not about me primarily. It's about them, right? And so when if they've got kind of a struggle, one path I could go down is like, oh, that's fascinating. Like, I wonder how did you get to the point where you developed this like belief system, like that would be super interesting to me to like get into all the gory details of like how you were brought up and all the influences that contributed to this and like blah, 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 blah. But that might be interesting to me, but that is not necessarily gonna be helpful for my client, right? What might be more helpful for them is just literally having someone say like, no, it's not weird that you feel that way. Like, yeah, like that makes a lot of sense that you feel this way given X, Y, and Z. Or maybe it's something more kind of, okay, you're feeling really anxious. I don't know where that came from. Like maybe we're not going to put that all together, but what is your anxiety holding you back from? Like, what do you actually want to be able to do? And like, can we make a plan for doing that? I'm not all that interested in like why they don't want to be or what getting over their anxiety would allow them to do. I mean, I'm somewhat interested, but like, therapy is very different in the sense that you have to sort of inhibit your own personal sort of like interests or even like if I'm talking to someone about some struggle they have and I have this really good idea for why they're having it or like what they ought to do, that is deadly. Like that is poisonous. Because if I just say like, you know what? I just had this brilliant idea. This is what you need to do. Like, this is why you're feeling so anxious. It's because, like your mommy didn't love you enough or like, that's the cliche. That is deadly because the whole point of therapy is not you downloading information into people. It's helping people come to their own realizations and develop their own capacity to live their life the way they want to live it. So it takes a lot of finesse and self-restraint, I think, in therapy to sort of slowly kind of guide people indirectly. And that is just not the way I approach podcasting. I'm just like totally selfish and like, wait, what? Like, this is really interesting. Why do you think this? Or like, what's this about? Like, so I don't know, that's probably much more than you wanted to know, but.
No, that was perfect. And what are some of the top, let's say, 3 skills that a therapist should have if you're thinking about like what you've done so far and thinking about, oh my God, I couldn't do this without this skill?
Now, let me ask you a question back, kind of a clarifying question back. Do you mean sort of like prerequisite skills? Like you're an admissions officer at a...
No, like practical skills.
Okay. So like say you are a therapist and you want to become a better therapist, like what kind of skills do you need to have? Yeah. Okay. So I think the first one is like what I just mentioned, which is it's basically like good listening 101. You have to be able to have a brilliant idea pop into your head. And if the time is not right for that idea, you have to be able to stuff it back in your back pocket and just almost ignore it so that the process in front of you can continue on in the way it needs to. And that is so hard. Like I struggle a lot with that. It's really, really hard, I think. And so that's just something like, I don't even know if it's a skill. I think of it like it's like a practice. It's just something you have to like, like when you hear like monks talking about meditating, they're not doing it like as a skill so that they can be a more effective like CEO or something. They're doing it because it's like a way of life. It's like a way of being. And they just need to constantly be just practicing that and refining that and honing that capacity. So I think that's a really big one, is to be able to kind of hold your own junk, no matter how awesome you think it is, and really keep in mind, is this actually going to be helpful? And then the other skill is this, I think of it as like the technical term might be Socratic questioning, which it goes back to this idea of, in the long run, you're not going to help people learn or even change by just giving advice and like telling them what to do, right? It's not going to work. It may even backfire, actually, because in general, when we're given advice, most of us get a little defensive. Like, no, I don't want to be given advice. You can't tell me what to do. Like our like inner toddler sprouts up or maybe inner teenager, and we get like kind of rebellious. And so it's not a great way in the long run to really help people. And Socratic questioning is, instead of giving advice, you ask questions or even provide statements that kind of nudge people to ask themselves better questions and then arrive at the solution themselves. Go ahead.
What's an example of that?
Yeah. So if like, let's say my client is coming to me and they're saying like, Yeah, I've just been so lonely because like I can't like have my usual like coffee date with my best friend every Wednesday and like get lunch with them. And yeah, I'm just so lonely, you know? And my thought, you know, like the thought pops into my head of, well, like, you know, like you could just you could just decide to like pick up coffee and like meet each other at the park, like something really simple. Like it's not rocket science. I'm not going to tell him that. I can't just like tell him that. So I might say like something like as simple as like, yeah, it sounds like coffee is like, you know, getting coffee with your best friend is really important. Like that's a really important thing to you. I wonder if there are other ways you could still end up getting coffee, even though you guys can't go to Starbucks together.
Gotcha.
Right. And I know if you're listening to this, you're probably like, yeah, it sounds super lame. Like, of course. But here's the thing. When we're struggling, and I challenge anyone to, to say this is wrong, it's really hard to think of like the right thing to do or to think creatively when we're struggling with something, right? When everything's going great, yeah, sure, it's easy to think really clearly and like be creative. But when you're really struggling with something, that's hard. It's surprisingly hard to do. So really simple things like that, these kind of like reflections or kind of gently leading questions. And it's not even that I'm literally like, I have this master plan and I'm just trying to lead them over there. I'm just trying to get them to think more generatively, right? Or to point, if they say like, well, like, you know, I guess I just have to give it up. Like, I'm just not going to be able to get coffee with my friend for the next year. I might gently kind of challenge that by saying like, oh, so let me get this right. Like the idea is because Starbucks is closed and you can't go in there anymore with your friend, like you have to write off coffee altogether with your friend. And even just something like that might kind of force them to go back and go, okay, yeah, I guess that was like a little bit extreme. Like maybe it's not quite that dire. But the principle is really they should be doing the work. You can't do the work for them, right? Like any good, like a personal trainer knows, like if you're doing the reps on the bench press for your client, like you're not doing your job. That is not your job. And it actively would get in the way of the goal your client wants to achieve.
It's like holding up a mirror to someone and saying like, here, look at yourself. Look at the statement that you just made. And do you like that? Do you agree with that? Okay, yes. If not, we'll go in a different direction. I think that's really interesting.
Exactly. And sometimes it's just giving people honestly, giving people the space to be creative with their own struggles. I think in daily life, like we're also stressed out and busy that we're just putting out fires and we're trying to not let our anxiety like ruin our family life or our work job, our jobs and so we never get a chance to just literally kind of like reflect slowly and think a little bit creatively about our struggles. And so sometimes you'll hear therapists or coaches sometimes talking about holding the space, like the skill of holding the space for someone. And that's kind of what you're doing. You're just like creating this little bubble. And I don't love the term like safe space, but you're creating maybe a creative space for people and you're helping them to find creative solutions to their difficulties.
How do you personally find yourself getting more creative? If you are having struggles creatively, then what do you do? What are your practices to go to?
Yeah, so I guess there's a few things. The first is I'm just always really plugged into other creative people, or at least people I think are creative. Like I kind of obsessively follow like a small core group of people online who I just think are brilliant and really creative and thoughtful and interesting. And I don't know, it's like osmosis. Like I'm not saying they make me brilliant, but they help me think a little bit more creatively, just being around them, you know? And so that's really like reading is a good example of this, right? Everybody talks about reading a lot and like, it's true. It's a great habit, right? Because like there is this kind of osmosis process where reading a good book forces you, I think, to ask good questions, to consider things from different perspectives, to tap into like reading a really touching novel helps you tap into an idea in a non-intellectual way, right? You can like feel it more emotionally because you're getting it in an embodied way through a character, right? Similarly, like when you're listening to a podcast, right? Like I love Tyler Cowen. Like his conversations with Tyler is like one of my favorite podcasts. It's not because like the guests are kind of interesting and they're super random and diverse and what they have to say is interesting. But I listen to that podcast because the way Tyler Cowen thinks is just really fascinating and creative. And it often, in very little ways, it helps me think a little bit differently. Like I literally will sometimes find myself thinking like, yeah, how would Tyler like interview this guest? Or like, how would he think about this issue I'm writing about? So that's, I think the first principle is just, you've heard that Jim Rohn quote, like you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time around.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's like research. I don't even know how you would begin to like quantify that or support that empirically, but I believe that like wholeheartedly. I think there's so much to that. And I think it's one of the real amazing bright spots of the internet and social media and all this stuff that people love to complain about and criticize. If harnessed well, like the capacity to literally spend time around brilliant, super smart, creative, thoughtful, amazingly kind people, you can do that. You can take someone who like for me, Tyler Cowen, and like he can, I don't know if he's actually like one of the top 5 people I spend the most time around, but he's not that far off, honestly. Like if you consider the time I spend listening to him and reading the stuff he writes, and like he's pretty high up there on the list. And so you can cultivate this group of like mentors from afar kind of and influences on you. So that is just people, like connections. I think being connected to people in a variety of different ways. I mean, it's not just people online. It's like my wife. Like one of the things I love about my wife and one of the things I really value in her in our relationship is just we're so compatible in terms of discussing things, having difficult conversations, whether it's our own stuff or a political issue or whatever. Like we're just really good, I think, in a very balanced way at kind of really thinking through things together. And like that helps me so much to be able to have those conversations with her. And again, it's not that like she's just like feeding me brilliant insights that are helping me. It's this like magic, like sort of dance like between us that ends up being mutually beneficial to both parties. And so I know it's a little like abstract, I guess, but I just think that's the most important part.
That's amazing. And what do you suggest to someone who is having trouble pursuing a difficult conversation? Because that sounds like one of your strengths. So what do you recommend?
Okay. So the first, this isn't even advice. This is more like a caveat is I think you have to be careful about who you decide to have those conversations with in the first place. There are just some people who are not going to be capable of it. And it might be because of their own issues. It might be because they're just not a good fit. Like it's just a weird personality fit between the two of you. So just because there's someone you spend a lot of time with, whether it's your spouse or your best friend or your parents or whomever it is, don't assume that just because you spend a lot of time with them, or just because they're important, or just because they're really smart, or just because they know a lot about a certain topic, don't assume that means they're going to be a good conversational partner for you. Right. So that's the first like trap I think you should avoid. But then assuming you have someone for whom it's possible for the two of you to have those really generative conversations, that skill I mentioned earlier of being able to have a good idea that you just want to like spit out, whether it's about something they said or something you want to throw out, you have to build up a tolerance for holding that and like delaying that. I think sometimes you are just going to spit stuff out and that's fine. But if you can't resist that impulse, it's going to be really hard, right? Because you have to give people space and time to develop their ideas. And so I think that's a really big one. The other one I would say is cultivating curiosity about your own difficult emotions. So in conversations with, in any sort of intense conversation, whether it's, I don't know, like you're having tons of anxiety and you're talking to your spouse about like, I don't know, what do I do? Or you're discussing like some new development in politics that's really controversial or like whatever it is, the thing that will derail good conversations fastest is your own kind of difficult emotions. You get really defensive. You get really anxious. You get really impatient. You get really like whatever it is, or you get insecure. You feel like, is what I'm saying like smart enough? Do they think I'm done? You just like all that junk. I think the skill is to don't imitate what I just did, which is call it junk and get judgmental with yourself. That's the wrong thing to do. Instead, I think you want to cultivate curiosity, like, okay, so like my wife just made this statement about some political belief I have, right? And I feel myself getting angry. Like, what's that about? Like, I wonder why that prompted anger, right? Or I keep worrying about what this person thinks anytime this topic comes up. Like, like what's going on there? Like, why might that be the case? And maybe you decide like, well, there's no deep, dark reason. Maybe you realize like, oh yeah, like it's pretty normal to care what other people think about you. Like, despite what all the self-help books say, like it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you because you care about what other people think. Like, of course you do. You're a human being. That's what we do. Like we like cooperate, and we have hierarchies in society, and it matters like where you stand with other people. So I think that being able to monitor your own emotional state during a difficult, maybe intellectually challenging conversation, super hard. Like, this is pretty high level. It's taken a lot of bandwidth, right? But being able to do that, to monitor your own emotional state and then react to it from a place of curiosity rather than judgment or criticism, huge. I mean, that like, if you can do that, your conversational like potential just goes up exponentially, I think.
Were you always someone who was able to look at their emotions in third person? Because it sounds like that's what you're doing. And could you take us back to a situation when maybe you weren't like that?
Oh yeah, sure. Like I wouldn't say I certainly wasn't always, and not that I'm that great at it now. I think I'm definitely better than I was. And as a therapist, I would like to think I'm okay at it at least. But I would say in part, I think I've always had maybe somewhat of an advantage because I am so motivated by intellectual curiosity that oftentimes that will like outcompete insecurity or some kind of painful emotion. So someone like criticizes some deeply held belief that I have, right? And it hurts for me. But if I'm interested enough in that conversation, that like desire to learn more and really understand will sometimes override it. So I think part of it is just temperamental. Like I'm like weird that way, that I'm so drawn to intellectual stimulation that it can kind of, it helps me avoid some of those more emotional traps. But no, to a large degree though, it is something you have to cultivate. And I think about like my early relationships dating, for instance, were a really big like testing ground for this, and me realizing how bad I was at this. And then figuring out like, okay, like if I like pretty clearly, like if I want to be a good boyfriend, like I need to figure this junk out, like why I'm getting defensive or like why I'm getting really critical or why I'm being so like advice givey in these conversations. Like what's going on there? Because it's miserable when the relationship isn't going well and I want things to go better. So I actually think I would point to those early experiences dating. Sorry, ex-girlfriends. But those were crucial for me in kind of my own like self-awareness and like self-regulation, like learning to be able to manage that junk that comes up. I think that was key for me.
And I think that so often we are so quick to be upset at ourselves for acting a certain way to those ex-girlfriends or whatever it may be. But it's like that person helped get you to where you currently are today. So why not be grateful for that person, right?
Totally. So, yeah, so much so.
Yeah. So you have a quote that I pulled from Twitter that I just loved and I wanted you to talk about a little bit.
Sure.
It was, obsessing over your flaws and mistakes is just as narcissistic as obsessing over your strengths and successes. Just it kind of stopped me in my tracks for a second. I was like, that's true. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, sure. So that a lot of my quotes on Twitter come from, I'm in the middle of writing an article on some topic, and I just I'm writing and I'm like, oh, like that's a one-liner, like that's a little like idea that kind of stands on its own. I'll just throw it on Twitter. But that came from when I was writing an article about self-compassion and the importance of self-compassion. And I think self-compassion is a really misunderstood concept. I think a lot of people think of it as sort of this like kind of woo-woo, like hippie, like woo-woo hippie nonsense, like love yourself, self-compassion. Like it sounds a little like fluffy and kind of shrinky, like something like your overly sappy shrink would tell you to, like, yeah, you just need a lot more self-compassion. You just need to love yourself more. Which is perfect for me because I'm kind of a contrarian. So I love like taking like a misconception like that and sort of showing why actually self-compassion is super important and you're totally overestimating its importance. And one of the ways I do that is kind of create a crack in people's idea of self-compassion is to take its opposite and show how unhelpful it can be. And so take self-criticism, people who are like super perfectionistic or really, really hard on themselves and judgmental with themselves. If you think about it, you have to think about opportunity cost, which is all the time and energy I spend replaying that mistake I made or that dumb thing I said when I put my foot in my mouth or that whatever. That's all time and energy that can't go towards something productive and good. Or in like an interpersonal context, all the time and energy I spend ruminating on my mistakes and like that like stupid spelling error I made in my blog post article that like someone sarcastically like reminded me of on Twitter. If I'm sitting at the dinner table and that's what's going through my mind, I'm not being present with my family. And that is super lame. In fact, it's narcissistic. Like I'm obsessed with myself at the expense of other people. And it's just lame. Like, I don't think any of us wants to be in that, but I think a lot of people don't realize it. They think that like, they sort of fall victim to the what I think of as like the slippery slope fallacy, which is if I just move a little bit in the direction of taking it easy on myself, I'm going to become this like lazy, self-entitled narcissist who all they care about is themselves and they don't care about other people. And like, all they think about is how great they are. And that's just like an insane argument. Just because you're taking it a little bit easy on yourself, you're being a little bit gentle with yourself, you're applying the same standard you would apply to a friend who is struggling, which is that you would be empathetic, you would be understanding, you would be patient with them. Why, what's with the double standard? Why can't we apply that to ourselves, right? So that whole tweet was just, it was a kind of an indirect way to get people to think differently about self-criticism and self-compassion in that spectrum, and how just because you like ease up on yourself 10%, like that doesn't mean you're going to become a narcissist. In fact, you're much more likely to become a narcissist by being overly self-critical and judgmental.
Just a way different way to think about the world and really appreciate it. And one thing that I was just thinking of when you were talking is like, we are so quick to say, I love you to someone else, but it's hard for us to say, I love you to ourselves. And that's just such an interesting concept. So what do you think about that as a therapist?
Yeah, it's wild. So I should have a caveat. I was using the term narcissist a little loosely. Like I don't, there's a clinical sense of like what a narcissist is. And that is like, it's a thing. People struggle with it. I don't want to, I shouldn't make light of that. What I'm talking about more is being narcissistic. Like we can all kind of be a little bit narcissistic sometimes or self-centered. So just to kind of clarify that, but your question about like why we relatively easily are able to express and give love to other people and give compassion, empathy, like support, understanding, all that stuff. I think most of us are actually pretty good at it. Like if you just think about, you meet a friend after work and they made some huge mistake at work and they're just like, oh my God, like I'm going to get fired. I can't believe I did that. I bet you most people listening to this are not going to, their first response wouldn't be like, yeah, man, you're screwed. You're definitely fired, right? Or like, how could you do that? Like, what are you, an idiot? Like, I can't believe you. You don't talk, you wouldn't have friends if that's how you talk to your friends, right? Ironically, that's how a lot of us talk to ourselves when we make mistakes. We're super hard on ourselves. So I think there are a lot of potential reasons for this. My kind of pet theory that I think maybe is sort of underrated or underappreciated, I'm not saying it's the only one, but it's what I call the drill sergeant theory of motivation. So if you think of a lot of like movies where there's some like young kind of like scrawny recruit who gets thrown into boot camp, and then there's like the hard ass drill sergeant who's going to make a man out of him and it's just like yelling at him and putting him down. And then like, 30-second montage, like little recruit gets buff and like has tons of confidence and like, ta-da, like they're a kick-ass soldier now, right? Ready to like save the day and be a hero. the issue there is the correlation does not equal causation. We assume that because the drill sergeant was there being a hard ass, that's what made them into like a superhero. I'm not super convinced that that is actually the case. I think when we're young, a lot of us internalize the idea that we need to be hard on ourselves to achieve, right? I think this probably starts in school for most people. And again, it's the problem of correlation, assuming causation based on correlation. So people, they get a B+ on a test, God forbid, and then they're just like super hard on themselves, right? They just beat themselves up for it. And then they go and study a ton and they get an A on the next test. They assume, I think we internalize that a big part of the reason why we got the A is because we were hard on ourselves. In my experience, though, successful people are successful despite their self-criticism, not because of it. It's the fact that you studied a ton more is what led to you doing well, right? But anyway, I think a lot of us just end up getting into this habit of being super hard on ourselves and self-critical. And we end up assuming that it's actually vital for continued success. Now we have a job. Now we're married. Now we have kids. So in order to do well in all these things, I need to keep being tough on myself. And if I ease up even a bit, maybe all that'll go away. And so I think that is why a lot of us have a hard time giving up those habits of negative self-talk, self-judgment, self-criticism, and partly why we're so resistant to the idea of self-compassion.
You ever notice when someone stubs their toe or does something a little bit silly, they immediately say to themselves, "You idiot, how could you do that?" And it's like, oh my God, what just happened in that moment was you witnessed someone's mind and you witnessed what someone does when they make a mistake. And that is going on if it's not a situation of immediate pain. That's going on if it just happens. And so it's really interesting to that point is like when you notice that and someone says it, it puts it in perspective of what exactly is going on in their head.
Yeah, it's really wild. I like to think about it as kind of like a nugget takeaway for this whole discussion here is I think about the sort of like the inverse of the golden rule. The golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? The other rule that we should all be very mindful of is do unto yourself as you would do unto others. Like when you screw up or when you're suffering, why not treat yourself like you would treat a friend who is suffering? Like what's so crazy about that? And I would say, try it in super small ways, right? Start small. Like you don't like, if you've never been a runner, you don't just go run a marathon, right? You go for a walk around the block, right? You jog for 10 minutes. So try it really small. Like next time you screw up somehow, like try and catch yourself and go, all right, what if I didn't beat the shit out of myself? Like what would happen? Is my life going to go to hell because I wasn't like crazy hard on myself? I mean, literally, I'm not going to tell. I don't know. Like, but maybe you could experiment for yourself and see what happens. I think you'd be surprised by the results.
Nick, so you seem to me like such a centered person, and it seems like you're able to view things from a third perspective, maybe from all your training and everything. But I'm curious how your family, like having a family, I noticed in the header of your Twitter profile is like your family all there. How has having a family changed your approach to life?
It's definitely humbling. Like before having a family, I never would have thought of myself as an angry person. But it's really made me realize one of my biggest weaknesses is I have like a pretty low frustration tolerance and I'm pretty impatient as a person. And I think I've been lucky in that I've crafted a life to where impatience is largely a virtue and it doesn't really become a problem in most of my life. So if I'm just impatient to get a blog article out, I'm just going to crank it out. And like, cause I'm impatient and like, I don't want to wait. This is too good. I just want to get it out there. But having kids has really made me realize, like in that respect, for instance, that it's just a huge weakness for me. And it's really, really hard. Like when my toddler has a meltdown, which is totally normal for toddlers to have. And then I have my own 35-year-old psychologist meltdown because I'm mad that she didn't listen the first time to clean up her clothes. Like, what the hell is that all about? Like, that's so ridiculous, right? And so it's just, I would like to think that in the long run, it's exposed some weaknesses and things for me to try and work on that will not only help me be a better spouse and parent, but hopefully will help in other aspects of my life. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. Is it? I think having kids and being married too, or I don't know, being in any sort of like long-term relationship, it really exposes a lot of your weaknesses and flaws. And I mean, I feel lucky that I'm relatively well equipped to manage that. I think a lot of people don't have either the internal or external resources to know even how to manage that. And so it ends up getting worse. Having those insecurities exposed just leads to a lot more like shame and kind of acting out and stuff like that. So I feel really lucky. I mean, just everything from my background and the way I was raised to having a super awesome spouse who, for instance, is willing to like call me on my shit and say like, that was a little ridiculous that like you had a tantrum right after your daughter had it. You had a tantrum about your daughter having a tantrum. Like, lame.
That's the 10 by 10 where 10 guilt plus 10 equals 100 instead of 20.
Totally.
But it must be really interesting because toddlers don't care about your patience or lack of patience. They move at their own speed. And it kind of reminds me of nature in general, which moves at its own speed. It doesn't care if you want it to be summer when it's winter, you have to wait. Like nature has its own speed. So what tips would you give to someone who's trying to be more patient and let things play out the way they are?
Yeah, I think so. There's a few kind of little kind of mini micro skills in there. The first one is just like emotional self-awareness or just being aware of your own emotions. I think so often, very understandably, we just tend to avoid painful emotions. Like we tend to avoid painful anything, right? So I think we all have built up little reactions where as soon as like, I don't know, anxiety shows up on the scene, our reflexes look that way, right? Or as soon as like impatience comes up, I immediately go to, well, why can't they do the thing I just told them to do, right? And what that is like, I don't want to look at that impatience because on some core level, I know that's like a flaw or something I need to work on, right? So I think being able to remind yourself that, again, just because I feel bad doesn't mean I am bad. Just because I have this thing called, sadness, right, or grief, and it feels awful, that doesn't mean there's something wrong. It doesn't mean that I'm wrong for feeling that. And for me, like just because I'm feeling impatient, being able to catch that impatience and then validate it for myself and tell myself, look, man, like you're a parent, every parent in the world can relate to what you're going through right now. Doesn't mean you're a bad parent or anything. Like this is one of your things. It comes up. Like, how do you want to respond to that? And so I think it goes back to that awareness of and curiosity about your own emotions, especially your painful emotions, really trying to try to be conscious of your painful emotions, whether it's impatience or anxiety or whatever, and then to try and slowly get better at approaching those from a standpoint of curiosity rather than judgment. I think that's so key. And it's honestly like, there's no like 4-step frameworks for how to do, like you just slowly have to try and just kind of become more and more aware of it and have a little self-compassion. You're not going to be amazing at it right off the bat. It's going to take time, just like anything else. And be kind of gentle with yourself about it.
Nick, this has been such a pleasure. I'm so grateful for your time and wisdom. What do you have anything else to add to this conversation before we wrap it up? Anything else you'd like to mention? I've had such a great time. No,
this has been great. I really appreciate you having me on, Danny. It's been like, you're a great interviewer. Like that's always gratifying as a podcastee, as someone being interviewed. It's nice to have a good interview. And clearly you've got a lot of experience now in a relatively short amount of time. So good for you.
I appreciate that. Where can people find you if they want more Nick in their life?
Yeah. So my kind of hub for all my work online is just my personal website, which is my name, nickwignall.com, NICKWIGNALL.com. And you can find like, I don't know, articles, links to my podcast, my newsletter. I send out a newsletter every Monday morning. That's probably the best place to go.
Awesome. Those will all be in the show notes at dannymiranda.com/podcast. Thank you, Nick, again for joining us. And it's been a lot of fun.
Same. Thanks for having me, Danny.